In the news tonight, at the opening of the 10th annual Clinton Global Initiative, His Majesty the King says Jordan has managed to transform the Arab Spring into a positive development by overcoming the shocks and difficulties that affected the region. The United States and Arab states bombed Islamic State targets in Syria for the first time, killing scores of terrorists and opening a new front against them, with the Pentagon saying it's only the beginning. And the United Nations zeroes in on climate change, giving leaders from 125 countries a platform to explain how they plan to address the issue. Good evening and welcome to a new edition of the news. Here are the details. His Majesty the King took part in the 10th annual meeting of the Clinton Global Initiative that was also attended by Her Majesty Queen Rania and some 1,000 leading world personalities. The Clinton Global Initiative was launched in 2005 and aims to transform entrepreneurial ideas into actions that reflect positively on the communities in various countries around the world. The initiative acts as a platform gathering world leaders to advise and implement innovative solutions to the most pressing international challenges. Former U.S. President Bill Clinton moderated a panel discussion in which King Abdullah presented his views on regional and international matters. In opening remarks, Clinton pledged support to Jordan to help the country deal with the repercussions of conflicts in Syria and Iraq and the ongoing flow of refugees. He said aid to the kingdom is hardly enough to feed refugees and urged the international community to stand by Jordan. King Abdullah thanked the former U.S. President for the Clinton Initiative in support of Jordanian local communities hosting Syrian refugees, namely in the areas of energy, water, and municipal services. Clinton lauded His Majesty's efforts towards peace and security in the region. Here's an excerpt.
Tell us something positive. What should the world know about the potential of the Middle East based on what's actually going on that can't possibly find its way into a headline now because of all the trouble? What do you want us to know positive about Jordan? What do you want us to know positive about the region?
Well, I used to say to all the delegations that used to come to Jordan that it can't get any worse, but I've stopped saying that. Look, the good story is, I think, is that, and the challenge at the same time is 60% of the country is under the age of 30, and for small countries like Jordan, that's a positive thing. We have a young population, highly educated, tech-savvy, that has been very resilient. I mean, if you look at the history of Jordan, for many decades, the country that is initially always sort of written off is Jordan. And it's not by accident that over many decades, Jordan has survived all the shocks that the region has produced. And it's because of the people. And so as we have seen over the past 2 years, 3 years, we looked at Arab Spring, which was a major crossroad for the Arabs. And as opposed to revolution, it was evolution. We managed to move forward. And as a result, opened our doors, which is the natural way of things that happen in Jordan. We've been a country that's always welcomed refugees because it's the right thing to do. You did mention the tremendous burden that we have in our country, but with the tremendous economic burdens, the economy is coming back. Everybody says to us, we're just shocked that Jordan is doing what it's doing, suffering as it's suffering, but we're still keeping our heads above water. And I think that's the secret of Jordan. Part of it is because there is this relationship between the private sector and the public sector. We have invested in our youth. There's a lot of programs that are going on now between the private sector and public sector in PPPs. There's a lot of investment coming into Jordan. But the other side of the story is, unless we get help by the international community on the burden of refugees, which is affecting the government of Jordan. Last year, for example, most of the aid that comes from the international community and from donors, which is extremely appreciated, only accounts for about 39% of the aid that we need. The rest is the burden on the Jordanian economy. This year, the burden of Syrian refugees is going to be about $3 billion. So again, we're probably going to expect only 40% of aid coming from outside is going to cover that. So how can we balance this dichotomy of the burden of Syrian refugees to the economy that is growing back? And how do we give faith to the young people that need to come into the workforce? And when I say that 60% of the country is under the age of 30, it's the same thing across the Middle East. So when I reach out and look to people around the room, this is the challenge that I think all of us have. It's not just Jordan, it's how do we give the hope and promise to the youth globally, but to youth of the Middle East that feel that they've been abandoned. And this is where we have to get it wrong. I mean, the challenge, as you just alluded to, is not just Syria and Iraq. It's Lebanon, it's in the Sinai, it's Libya. We're seeing it in Yemen, we're seeing it in Nigeria, Somalia. So as we're talking about the politics of a coalition over this week in the United Nations, we are looking at Syria and Iraq, but we have to look at the other elephants in the room. It has to be a comprehensive approach. President Obama understands this, but it's how do we bring it together to look at a comprehensive fight, which it really is, between good and evil, and giving the younger generation the promise that we do care about them and their future. Just one sort of sideline of information. As we try to create jobs and opportunities for the youth, ISIS today is providing foreign fighters $1,000 a month in salaries, which to people in Jordan is the equivalent of middle class to higher middle class income. If we don't get this right, if we don't step up to this moral responsibility, how are we going to be able to combat this extremism? So it's something that is now global. We're all invested in it. It's no longer a fight that we're fighting inside of the Middle East. If you're looking at the issue of foreign fighters coming in from all over the world, as far as China, we're all in this together. And so this is a global fight.
Earlier, His Majesty met with members of the Clinton Initiative, including businessmen and philanthropists, involved in supporting a national plan to assist local communities cope with the needs of hosting Syrian refugees. The meeting pledged assistance to Jordan in the areas of water, environment, renewable energy, and basic services. The session aimed to convey to the world the extent of challenges Jordan faces as a result of receiving waves of Syrians fleeing the war in their country. On the sidelines of his participation in the UN General Assembly, His Majesty the King met in New York late yesterday with Spanish monarch Felipe VI. The meeting dealt with relations between Jordan and Spain, as well as a crisis in the Middle East and international efforts to address numerous challenges facing the region. The United States led airstrikes against Islamic State terrorists in Syria, hitting training camps, headquarters, vehicles, and other sites under the control of IS. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates also joined in the strikes. The U.S. and Arab strikes on terrorists in Syria were just a start of a coalition effort to weaken the extremist Islamic State group. Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan said his country could give military or logistical support to U.S.-led strikes. And British Prime Minister David Cameron is expected to announce as soon as tomorrow that Britain is ready to join airstrikes against IS and that he plans to seek Parliament's approval. Here's more.
It's the first time that the United States, backed by Arab states, has bombed Syria as it pursues a campaign against the Islamic State terrorist group in the heart of the Middle East region. The aim, according to the White House, was to disrupt planning by the Khorasan group as an Al-Qaeda affiliate to launch imminent attacks against U.S. or European targets. U.S. President Barack Obama said the coalition against the IS terrorists now includes more than 40 countries.
The strength of this coalition makes it clear to the world that this is not America's fight alone. Above all, the people and governments of the Middle East are rejecting ISIL and standing up for the peace and security that the people of the region and the world deserve.
The Pentagon called the first round of airstrikes against Islamic State targets inside Syria a success.
Our initial indication is that these strikes were very successful. Second, while it's not our policy to discuss future operations, I can tell you that last night's strikes were only the beginning.
Dozens of air and missile strikes hit against IS targets in northern and eastern Syria include training camps, command and control centers, storage facilities, and weapon supplies. This video shows civil defense workers pulling bodies from the rubble of damaged buildings following the US-led airstrikes. At least 70 Islamic State fighters were reported killed, plus 50 other extremists linked to Al-Qaeda in separate strikes inside Syria, which the US conducted alone. The attacks took place with no objection from Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's government, which Washington says was notified in advance. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad said Syria is determined to continue its war on terrorism and that he supported any international effort. An Iraqi envoy was in Damascus today to brief Assad on the next step in efforts to combat terrorism. Farah Ajlouni for the News at 10.
Minister of State for Media and Communication and the government spokesman Mohammed Al-Momani said the continued assaults on Jordanian borders by terrorist groups led Jordan to take preemptive measures to confront terrorism before it reaches the homeland. In a statement to JTV reporter Brahim Khresha, Momani confirmed that Jordan armed forces launched an airstrike on Islamic State terrorist positions on Syrian territory.
Jordan started this morning with airstrikes against positions of ISIS. Our Air Force pilots started targeting specific selected positions in order to crack down and strike on the positions of the terrorist organization ISIS. We will continue our effort in order to target this organization and stop it from undermining the security and safety of the Jordanian state and the Jordanian people. There has been several attempts to try to infiltrate across our borders, and there has been no ability of the neighboring countries to stop these organizations from targeting our borders. So we think that we should preempt this and take whatever steps necessary in order to stop terrorist organizations from attacking our country and our borders in the attempt to achieve the goal of securing the Jordanian state and ensuring the stability of the Jordanian people.
The United Nations Refugee Agency said it is making contingency plans in case all 400,000 inhabitants of the Syrian Kurdish town of Kobani fled into Turkey to escape advancing Islamic State terrorists. Some 138,000 Syrian Kurdish refugees have entered southern Turkey in an exodus that began last week. At least 105 villages around Kobani have been captured by Islamic State since last week, and an additional 100 villages have been abandoned or evacuated. The Kobani region is also host to over hundreds of thousands of Syrians displaced from other parts of the country, including Raqqa, Aleppo, and Hims. UNHCR said it is preparing for the potential of the whole population fleeing into Turkey.
$138,000 that just arrived in Turkey represents about the number that all of Europe has taken in the 3 years of the Syria war. So this is a large number of sudden influx. It's definitely one of the largest, and it's very possible that Turkey will receive more. So we consistently and again appeal to the international community to recognize Turkey and the other neighboring countries, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Egypt, that have taken on so much of the burden of hosting Syrian refugees, and to support these countries.
A first airlift of supplies for up to 200,000 people is due to arrive at Adana Airport from Amman tomorrow, to be followed by 3 more flights later in the week. And back here at home, Prime Minister Abdullah Noor dismissed as untrue allegations that the government had conspired against the lower house with regard to the draft pension law. Responding to comments by 2 lawmakers during a House session today, Noor stressed the government respects the legislature. He said that due respect of the House is in the government's interest because weakening the House amounts to weakening the political system. A royal decree last week rejected an amendment to the 2014 Civil Service Retirement Draft Law, which was earlier passed by Parliament. The draft law had proposed that lawmakers with 7 years of civil service should be entitled to lifetime pension. Despite Israel's killing of 2 Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, the Palestinian delegation to Gaza ceasefire talks in Cairo decided to proceed with negotiations, which began after a 2-hour delay. The Palestinian delegation said the timing of the Hebron raid was intended to undermine the talks, but Israel must not be given any pretext to escape from commitments of an August 26 truce. The truce agreement had called for talks within a month on long-term border arrangements for the blockaded Gaza Strip. Fatah official Azzam Al-Ahmad, who is leading the Palestinian delegation, said the talks were intended to set a schedule for wider negotiations likely to take place next month. The Palestinians want an end to the blockade of Gaza by Israel and are expected to press for construction of a seaport for Gaza and Israel's release of Hamas prisoners in the West Bank. In the meantime, there were clashes in the West Bank town of Hebron between occupation troops and Palestinians, hours after 2 Hamas members were killed in a shootout. Israel had spent months searching for Marwan Qawasmi and Ammar Abu Aisha after naming them as the killers of 3 Israeli teens abducted and killed in June. Occupation troops surrounded a house in Hebron at dawn before gunfire broke out. The army also destroyed 15 shops in the neighborhood of Jama. Following the firefight, dozens of Palestinians hurled stones at the soldiers who were firing live ammunition and rubber bullets at the crowds. Several protesters suffered a temporary asphyxiation after inhaling tear gas. Hamas spokesperson Sami Abu Zuhri said the assassination of Qawasmi and Abu Aisha is a war crime but will not weaken the Palestinian resistance. Climate change is under the spotlight at the United Nations, with a special summit held today on the sidelines of the General Assembly. The summit gives leaders from 125 countries a platform to explain how they plan to address climate change, adding political momentum to a UN process to negotiate a climate change agreement in Paris by next year. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, in his address at the opening ceremony, called on leaders to take the opportunity to build economic solutions.
Change threatens hard-won peace, prosperity, opportunity for billions of peoples. Today, we must set the world on a due course. Climate change is a defining issue of our age. It's a defining our present. Our response will define our future. Let us invest in the climate solutions available to us today. Economists have shown that this comes at minimal extra cost, while the benefits to our people and our planet are monumental. We need all public finance institutions to step up to the challenge. And we need to bring private finance from the sidelines. We must begin to capitalize Green Climate Fund. And we must meet the broader $100 billion a year pledge made in Copenhagen. Let us also put a price on carbon.
The South Korean president pledged to contribute up to $100 million to help the United Nations curb climate change. And French President François Hollande announced France will contribute $1 billion to a global fund to help poor countries adapt to the effects of climate change. Until today, German Chancellor Angela Merkel had been the only leader to make a large contribution, pledging $1 billion over 4 years in July to the fund.
Paris is a symbolic city, a city of freedom, of human rights, and I hope that in December 2015, Paris can also be a symbol of change for climate.
Please welcome
Hollywood celebrity and environmental activist Leonardo DiCaprio, recently named a United Nations Messenger of Peace, is using the post to raise awareness about climate change. He said he speaks not as an expert, but as a concerned citizen. He told the summit he was one of the 400,000 people who marched in the streets of New York on Sunday, and the billions of others around the world who want to solve our climate crisis. In 1998, the actor established the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, whose mission is protecting Earth's last wild places and building a more harmonious relationship between humanity and the natural world. The organization has contributed funds towards protecting tigers in Nepal, elephants in the wild, and marine animals, including sharks.
This body, perhaps more than any other gathering in human history, now faces this difficult but achievable task. You can make history or you will be vilified by it. To be clear, this is not about just telling people to change their light bulbs or to buy a hybrid car. This disaster has grown beyond the choices that individuals make. This is now about our industries and our governments around the world taking decisive, large-scale action.
Scores of striking Air France pilots took their protest to the streets, demonstrating in full uniform outside of France's National Assembly to demand government intervention to end an 8-day standoff. About 200 pilots took part in the demonstration. They opposed the proposed expansion of Air France KLM low-cost carrier Transavia, which the company sees as a way to cut costs and stay competitive. The main pilots union said management's offer yesterday to delay the expansion of Transavia until December was a smokescreen and accused the airline of trying to move jobs to countries with lower taxes and cheaper labor. Parent company Air France KLM said about half of all Air France flights have been cancelled since the strike started. While strikes are relatively common in France's labor forces, it's rare to see pilots protesting. Sharp elbows may be required when this handbag goes under the hammer, as it is dubbed the most desirable one in the world. Meet what could be the world's most expensive handbag. This particular Hermes diamond and white gold encrusted handbag could fetch a record amount of over $150,000 at an auction in Beverly Hills later today. The bag features a subtle coloration done in a Nilo crocodile, adorned with 18-carat wide gold and studded with 8.2 carats of diamonds. The sale of the Birkin is part of a Heritage Auctions luxury accessories auction, which includes 480 handbags from Chanel, Louis Vuitton, and other top designers.
Any more 3,000 fair warning. Sold for 6,000 at 5,500. Stay in the room at 5,500. Any more 5,500 Cherokee nuts. And to open the bidding, I have 550. 550. Do we have 600? I have 6 1/4. Do we have 6 bidder? How about 650 in the room? I need 8.
Nicole David beat compatriot Lo Wei-Wern in the Asian Games squash final in South Korea, earning her 4th singles gold. The 7-time world champion and world #1 for more than 8 years, David cruised to a 9-11, 11-6, 11-5, 12-10 victory. David had been central to squash's bid to get onto the Olympic program for 2020, but the IOC rejected the sports bid. Squash had been pitted against wrestling and a joint baseball and softball. Roger Federer was announced as the replacement for the injured Rafael Nadal in the lineup for the Indian Aces team for the opening of the International Premier Tennis League starting in November. Federer, who will be aiming to help Switzerland win the Davis Cup against France in Lille on November 21 to the 23rd, will then be heading off to Manila for the first of the 4 rounds of the league, which begins on November 28. The Swiss will be spearheading the Indian Aces, the league's Indian franchise, with Pete Sampras, Gael Monfils, Ana Ivanovic, Sania Mirza, Rohan Bopanna and Fabrice Santoro as his teammates. And finally, cool weather in the hilly areas prevails tonight, while it continues to be fair in other regions with northwesterly light to moderate winds. As for tomorrow, a slight rise in temperature is expected, but it remains moderate in most parts of the kingdom. Winds will be northwesterly moderate to brisk. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect relatively hot conditions with northerly moderate to brisk winds and slightly high seas. You now look at temperatures forecast for tonight and tomorrow. And to close, here's a reminder of the day's top stories. At the opening of the 10th Annual Clinton Global Initiative, His Majesty the King says Jordan has managed to transform the Arab Spring into a positive development by overcoming the shocks and difficulties that affected the region. The United States and Arab states bombed Islamic State targets in Syria for the first time, killing scores of terrorists and opening a new front against them, with the Pentagon saying it's only the beginning. And the United Nations zeroes in on climate change, giving leaders from 125 countries a platform to explain how they plan to address the issue. And with this, we come to the end of this edition of the news. I'm Ali Touqan. Thank you for joining us and have a good night.